Good afternoon, welcome. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Miata Fambolet. I am Chief Executive of the New Economics Foundation, and I'm absolutely delighted that you'll be joining us for an afternoon that I hope will be stimulating, lively, and bring an end to what has been an incredible week of events. Today is co-hosted by us at the New Economics Foundation and the European Trade Union Confederation on behalf of the coalition Fiscal Matters. It's sponsored by the European Parliament and the European Economic and Social Committee. And we are going to have a fantastic lineup of speakers to both stimulate a debate and provoke us to think about some big issues. The afternoon will be split in two halves. We're going to start off with two keynote speeches by Marco Butti and Joseph Stiglitz. Both need no introduction, but I'll introduce them properly in a minute, and then we'll move on to a panel discussion. I thought I'd start with a bit of context to why we are here today, why we believed it was so important to have this week of debate, and what we hope to achieve at the end of it. As many of you will know, the European Commission is reviewing the effectiveness of the Union's fiscal governance framework. And it's invited all stakeholders from across the European Union to have a public debate about this very question. So a group of us across civil society and trade union movement have come together to organize this week of events in order to make our contribution to this big debate. I think our view is actually after the global financial crisis, too many policy decisions felt like they were being made behind closed doors, and the sort of conversation and debate that needed to happen about the shock that we'd been through, but the recovery that we wanted on the other side of it, and what that meant for the sort of policy framework we should have had, didn't happen. There is a lot of rhetoric, and I think well-meaning intention around the desire to build back better. But if we are serious about this ambition to build back better, we can't make the same mistake. We cannot have policy decisions that are so vital for the pathway that we take being made behind closed doors. So the Fiscal Matters Coalition, we hope that this is the first step in this open, inclusive debate about the sort of recovery we want, the challenge that we face, and the type of fiscal framework that we need to underpin that. We are feeling the economic aftershocks of the pandemic, and we know we're going to feel the reverberations of this for many years to come after the health crisis has ended. But the job in front of us is not just dealing with the economic impact of the pandemic itself, but all the vulnerabilities, all the issues, all the structural weaknesses in our collective economies that the pandemic has so exposed. Getting to these issues, getting this right, will need the right and the appropriate fiscal framework in order to enable us to act. And I think the view of ourselves at the New Economics Foundations, our colleagues within the Fiscal Matters Coalition, is that the fiscal framework that we have at the moment is woefully inadequate, and it does need to be overhauled. For us, we're deeply concerned by the fact that the current framework, it prioritizes debt reduction, it prioritizes balancing the budgets. Important, yes, but it does that at the expense of key economic, social, and environmental outcomes that we must grapple with and that we must prioritize. And it doesn't sufficiently factor in the downside risk of opting not to invest, of opting not to act in order to mitigate some of the impacts that we know will come from climate change, but also to realize some of the opportunities, green jobs, lifting people out of poverty, building the green infrastructure that will enable us to be resilient, but will also rebuild our communities. And it feels like this is the moment to start to ask ourselves those big questions. And this is the moment in order to rethink the assumptions underneath our fiscal framework. And if it didn't feel urgent anyway, because we've just come out of a once-in-a-generation pandemic, then other drivers. We are facing environmental breakdown. The cost of not acting, the cost of not mitigating the impacts of climate change down the line are likely to far outweigh the short-term cost in investing in a proactive strategy to deal with the climate crisis. And our fiscal framework has to take that head on. We know that there's a pathway to net zero, that is a technological pathway, but doing it in a way that is socially just is a huge, huge challenge. And it cannot and it will not happen if public investment does not do the heavy lifting. Our fiscal frameworks must take that into account. And then finally, we are in a world where monetary policy is constrained. There's a reason central bankers are now looking to governments and saying, this is the time for fiscal policy. Fiscal policy and the framework must recognize this. But arguably, most importantly, from where I'm coming from, we cannot, after everything that we have learned after a decade of austerity, after everything we have seen about how denuded our social protections have become after a decade of austerity, how weaker we are in terms of dealing with major crises when they come after a decade of austerity, we cannot go back to austerity. So surely this is the time, following a pandemic that has rocked our foundations to the core, that has turned the rule books upside down, this is the time to rethink our policy assumptions on a whole host of things, but critically and fundamentally to rethink our policy assumptions underpinning our fiscal framework. We hope today is the first step in this big conversation. And I think the commitment from us and our colleagues across the Fiscal Matters Coalition is that we will do our part. We will do everything that we can to support that debate and hopefully support a transformative new fiscal framework. So I will hand over to our two keynote speakers who will no doubt throw some challenges at us, provoke us, ask some big questions of us that will be the first step of the bigger conversation that we believe needs to happen. First, I'll introduce Marco Butti, who is Head of Cabinet for Commissioner Paolo Gentiloni, who is responsible in the European Commission for Economic Affairs and Taxation. From December 2008 until December 2019, he was Director General for Economic and Financial Affairs at the European Commission. He has a wealth of knowledge, huge insights, and we are absolutely delighted to be kicking off this conversation. Over to you, Marco.
Thank you very much, Mia. Thanks a lot for the introduction. I think you said it very well. I mean, the intention of the Commission is to open up our door and to have a discussion with the public in a as much informative way as possible. And I think events like this one are absolutely crucial to bring in, fresh air, new perspective on things, and to try to, to better understand what are what we want from our fiscal framework, from our coordination of economic policies, and how to make all this more participative. Because at the end of the day, if we do not have shared ownership of this, and I see this clearly shared ownership amongst member states, government policymakers, but if it does not permeate the civil society, social partners, economic actors, etc., it is going to be very difficult to change gear and do what is needed. So I think the spirit is a bit of this, and actually, in a sense, this may be one of the first, if not the first at all, high-level gathering after this speech by President von der Leyen on the State of the Union, where she announced that we would, in the next weeks, formally restart the public debate on the review of the economic governance framework. So this, in a sense, is an ex-ante implementation of her announcement. We are going to come up in a couple of weeks with a communication which takes stock of what has happened during the COVID crisis, the shock itself, and the response. And to learn from that to look into the future. When we launched the review back in February 2020, actually we were not very lucky there, because as we launched the review, maybe then the next day we had to put it in the drawer because of COVID, and we had to react immediately. So, and we did so, I think, suspending the adjustment requirements of the Stability and Growth Pact, and actually allowing a massive response on the part of the member states, national fiscal policies, together with clearly monetary policy, but also the decisions, very important decision we made at the European level, Next Generation EU, and SURE, which is a program to help on the short time work, which has been very, very successful, as well as other measures. So so what we do now, we restart this public consultation. The intention is to have this public consultation for a few months, and then in the first half of next year, timing I don't know exactly, but we would then, as Commission, draw the lessons of this debate and come forward with our proposal or orientation for the future. Now, if you allow me, I have prepared 2 slides, which I think they will be managed centrally. There you are. Okay, thank you very much. I think if you can show full screen, that would be even better. Great. Okay, fine. Right. So go back to February 2020. We launched the review, and basically what was covered in that in the review were 5 + 2 issues. 3 belonging to what you see here, fiscal behavior, and the second one is on governance. So in the review, we discussed, how to rein in very high public debt, how to improve the quality of public finances, how to make the rules more counter-cyclical, precisely to to stabilize the cycle and respond to shocks. And what is here under the heading of governance, there is the issue of simplification, so to make rules more understandable, more transparent, and the issue of ownership and enforcement, which is important. You see in the second column here what we indicated as key issue back in February 2020. I think my slide has disappeared. I don't know if it has disappeared just for me or for everybody. Okay, there is back. Okay, the first one is how to deal with public debt. Now, public debt, we know that conditions have changed since the Maastricht years. We are facing unprecedentedly low interest rates. Equilibrium interest rates have gone down substantially. At the same time, we know also that in a monetary union, the issue of public debt sustainability has not just disappeared. And actually, if you go back to a couple of years ago in my own country, Italy, when we had a not very pro-European government at first, we saw the market reactions and the spreads shot up quite substantially. So the issue of public debt is not gone out of the way. So one would want to ensure a gradual reduction over time without resorting to austerity. So we can be done in a more, let's say, gradual manner. I think we can done with a fiscal stance which is pro-growth and without austerity. So this is the first point, how to rein in public debt. The second is the issue of quality of public finances. And here, the key issue is how to favor growth-friendly expenditure, and in particular, how to ease the favor the double transition, in particular the green growth. And since then, we have Fit for 55 and all the things that you know very well. So how to favor green investment. So basically, how to put our money where our mouth is on favoring a new, different, more sustainable growth model. And then on the issue of counter-cyclical, we acknowledge the pro-cyclical bias of fiscal rules. Basically, what happens is that you have money poured in good times, which is spent, and then you don't have room for maneuver. You have lower margin, and then you tend to then restrict in bad times, which is precisely what you do not want. So that is the what we had on this. So correcting this pro-cyclical bias is key. Now on governance, there is the issue of simplification. I think very important. Here, what you see is I use the expression of the curse of the complete contract. What does it mean? Basically, it means that because of the lack of trust between member states and European institutions, there has been an attempt to codify all the possible state of the world in very precise manner, algorithms, etc., and making things extremely complex, and in particular, very precise algorithm on unobservable variables like potential growth, like output gap, like structural balances, etc., which make things extremely difficult to understand. So, and we know as economists that Professor Stiglitz is the first one who can confirm that complete contrasts do not exist. And we are in a world of known unknowns and unknown unknowns, as the COVID has. And there is a trade-off clearly between discretion and complexity here. Finally, on ownership, we have realized over the many years that the kind of sanctions that we have in Europe is very difficult to apply. So sanctioning with financial sanctions a sovereign state is very hard. So we need to find a system of incentives which allows to curb bad behavior, incentivize good behavior, and here greater ownership is important, and strengthening national fiscal frameworks, not only the European ones, is key. This is in a nutshell what we have in the February 2020. You fast forward to today, what are the lessons that one can draw from the COVID-19? Okay, the first one is that high public debt has become, I think, even higher, so 15 to 20 points. So we need here a strategy to gradually reduce the very high level of debt, possibly in a differentiated manner. Some tailor-made rather than pret-a-porter on the debt rules. So this, if you see in the little box there, I put a plus because I think this has become even more important after COVID. On the quality of public finances, here the Next Generation EU and the RRF, which is the Recovery and Resilience Facility, 750 plus billion is helping in the short term, but this is one-off for a few years, not a permanent tool. So in the medium term, the importance will actually go up. Overall, I think it is as important as it was before the crisis to improve the quality of public finance, favor green investment. I think is on the counter-cyclicality of fiscal rules, so supporting the cycle and behaving in good times. I think we have to internalize the large demand shocks, which were not considered relevant at the time of Maastricht. I think favor a balanced policy mix. Yet I think you mentioned yourself the ECB hovering around the effective lower bound. We triggered the general escape clause. I think that was a very wise decision. It worked very well. And there is the issue of a central fiscal capacity, a permanent one that is not for the very short term now. Now we have Next Generation EU, but in the medium term, this is an important issue. I would consider that overall, the combination of monetary policy being constrained, fiscal policy having larger responsibility, the importance of combining national and EU fiscal policy has led to an increase of the importance of this element in our debate post-pandemic. And finally, on simplification, I think it is even more complicated to rely now on unobservable variables. I mean, what is potential growth after COVID? What is the output gap right now? Very difficult to estimate these variables here. So better to focus on what the treaty calls gross errors rather than going for the fine-tuning that we sometimes have pursued in the past. And finally, there is the issue of enforcement, ownership, and here we have to combine a centralized responsibility at the EU level with stronger ownership at decentralized level. So we go to my second slide, and then I finish. Okay, here, okay, we got the shock, COVID, and we got a response. What kind of lessons for the future of the fiscal framework we can have from the Recovery and Resilience Facility, so Next Generation EU. Okay, the first thing is that the agreement at the political level and then at the institutional level, so Next Generation EU, has helped to rebuild trust. Trust is the key word in European coordination. So this would help, hopefully, the rebuilt trust to move away from ideological corners, because sometimes we have here the Mediterraneans versus the frugal, North versus Southern member states, etc., painting themselves in their own, I would say, psychological and ideological corner, and very difficult discussion. I think this rebuilding trust will help a lot. I think will help also to appreciate the benefits of what I call here vertical coordination, which is let's say, which is the combination of fiscal policy at national level and central fiscal impulse, which is Next Generation EU. Key in this is if and only if there is a serious implementation of the investment and reform plans that have been that are put forward by the member states, that have already been, many of which have already been adopted by the Commission and the Council, have led to the first disbursement of about 50 billion in August under Next Generation EU. The second point is the issue of how to improve green investment. A critical criticism on that is that when you adopt something green, then everything becomes green. So this is the greenwashing criticism. In the implementation of the programs of the recovery and resilience plans under Next Generation EU, we had to control the quality of investment, because one of the conditions is that at least 37% of the envelope will have to go to help the green transition. So we checked the investment and we labeled that green or not green. We also had a provision which is the do no significant harm, which is an important one, because you should not undo by measures which are harmful for the environment what you are, the good thing that you are doing with the 37% allocation. So there also we implemented this principle. Then we have the taxonomy, we have the green bonds. So I think we are better equipped now to deal with the criticism of greenwashing and to actually ascertain what green investment is. And finally, I think is we have credible reform and investment commitments. We have in the programs the milestones and the targets agreed with the member states that, you know, if met, will trigger the transfers from the EU budget. So this is an important impact on potential growth looking forward. So if we make some commitments, for instance, what has been proposed on having an expenditure rule looking forward, we will have to bring in the impact on potential growth of the reforms and investment that we are carrying out now. So it will have a favorable denominator effect in the way we assess the behavior of member states. So at the end of the day, this is my final word. You see the big arrow there. The key issue for reforming the fiscal rules is to rebuild trust between member states, to rebuild trust between the let's say the political establishment, the civil society, and all this should help to lower the political discount rate, which means basically that governments planning the policies and implementing them more, over taking into account a longer-term horizon rather than the electoral incentives, which actually make policies very myopic. Thanks a lot.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Incredibly clear, and both the sense of the framework that you're working around, but actually some of the really difficult trade-offs that you're having to work through. And I think the point that you made, and you made many a time, about trust underpinning this, trust amongst member states, within the institution as well, but also with civil society being a key denominator in all of this, I think was incredibly well made. I will hand over to Joseph Stiglitz, who again needs no introduction, but I will do a brief one for you. As many of you and all of you will know, Joseph is a Nobel laureate in economics, university professor at Columbia University, chief economist at the Roosevelt Institute, co-founder and co-president of the Initiative for Policy Dialogue, and author of Rewriting the Rules of the European Economy, an Agenda for Growth and Shared Prosperity. I'm absolutely delighted to have you with us today. Over to you, Joseph.
Well, thank you very much. And I'm going to echo a lot of things that Marco said. In my book that you just mentioned, Rewriting the Rules of the European Economy, what I emphasized was that the European rules, the Growth and Stability Pact, were, the 3% deficit, the 60% debt, 2% inflation rules were really arbitrary. There was neither theory nor evidence that supported those rules. They were pulled out of thin air, and yet they've played an enormous role in European policy. I've jokingly referred to them as the non-growth and instability pact, because I think in general they not promoted the objectives that they allegedly serve. And sometimes they're referred as the convergence criteria, but as I pointed out in my book, The Euro, they actually led to divergence because they put shackles on countries facing economic difficulties that made it difficult for them to recover. Overall, the pursuit of these kinds of rules and similar rules or mindset in the United States has led to the creation of excess capacity, a higher level of unemployment, a lower level of employment than is ideal or than we needed. We would have had more robust economic growth if we had an alternative framework, and I'll come to that later. They were motivated, these rules were motivated by a concern about cross-border externalities, that if one country had too much of a deficit, it would have spillover negative effects on other countries in terms of inflation. The evidence is that's not been a problem. In fact, Europe has been facing problems of deflation, not inflation, over the last 30, 40 years. So the underlying mental models that they had in their mind were absolutely wrong. There were other externalities, cross-border spillovers, that were far more important. For instance, those associated with the environment, those associated with the tax competition, the race to the bottom, the problems in Ireland and Luxembourg of trying to steal tax revenue from other countries. Those are the externalities that should have been focused on. And these macroeconomic externalities just never occurred. Now, the pandemic has put a new light on these fiscal constraints. I think it's obvious the rules were broken, and I think there's a broad consensus that they should have been broken, that it would have been disastrous had Europe obeyed those rules. But obviously, if you have rules that are going to be broken, it undermines the credibility of those rules. It's not the first time they were broken. Germany broke those rules back in the 90s as they were just being formulated. So what we now realize is that we need an alternative framework. And here I'm going to, in particular, echo what Marco talked about, the curse of the complete contract, the attempt in Europe to pretend that they can contemplate every possible situation, write down what to do in every possible situation. That kind of mentality reflects a lack of trust. It says we have to think about everything ex ante because we don't trust each other when the circumstances arise. And you are not going to have solidarity in Europe if you have that degree of lack of trust. The pandemic has illustrated the fact that there is deep uncertainty. No one anticipated the pandemic. There is no way you could have written a rule that said, if we are afflicted by a pandemic like this, this is what we will do. And, there is no way you could have anticipated in the United States, in the world, you could not have anticipated Donald Trump and what that would imply for global rules of trade. And I could go on that there are so many events that we cannot anticipate. Many people did not anticipate the 2008 financial crisis. And I can assure you that there will be more crises that we don't anticipate. What we now know is that we don't know, and that it was foolish for us to have pretended that we knew what were the shocks that we were going to face. Working with Peter Orszag, who was the director of the Office of Management Budget in the United States under President Obama, Bob Rubin, who was the Secretary of Treasury under President Clinton, and myself, we struggled to ask the question, is there an alternative framework to approach budget, macroeconomics, in the presence of this deep uncertainty? And we've recently wrote a paper trying to formulate such an approach that recognizes the difficulty of prediction, but at the same time recognizes that the basic law of economics is that resources are constrained. You have to think about sustainability. You can't pretend that you can write checks in an unlimited way. So you have to think about some framework of sustainability. And in these few minutes, let me just describe some elements of the framework that we developed. Part of it is that we know that there are going to be shocks and that the magnitude of those shocks can be ameliorated by automatic stabilizers, and that you can put in automatic ways that can help citizens cope with that. Unemployment insurance is the obvious example. We need to strengthen those automatic stabilizers. In the United States, we had these very peculiar debates about whether we should extend unemployment benefits when the unemployment rate was enormously high and Americans were suffering. In the end, we did it over and over again, but we used scarce political space to engage in a debate that we should not have had. It should be clear that if the unemployment rate is higher than normal, it means that citizens are not working because there's just no jobs, and we need to help them. And there should be a consensus in our society that in those circumstances, we automatically extend unemployment benefits. We strengthen those unemployment benefits. We don't leave people destitute in these kinds of moments. And by having that kind of framework of helping the most vulnerable in these times, we also strengthen the economy. We help resuscitate the economy, and makes our economy stronger. And that gives businesses confidence to make more investment because they know the economy is going to be more stable than it otherwise would be. So strengthening the automatic stabilizers is one example of the framework that we need going forward. But the second thing is we need more discretion. Those top-down anchors that have plagued Europe, those 2%, 3%, 60% numbers that I mentioned before that came out of thin air, they have to be put aside. You need to have more trust and say, when we face an unusual situation, and we over and over again face these unusual situations, we have to trust each other that we will respond to that. Our democratic process will respond in responsible ways. And I think if I look at the European Commission, it consistently has acted in a very responsible way. So we need to have more discretion. As we think about where that discretion will take us, I think I want to echo the point that Marco made. It's much more important to think about, if you have too high of a debt GDP ratio, the right way to respond is not austerity, which is to get the debt and deficit down. That strangles the economy, but to get the denominator up by growing the economy. And that's what many countries did after World War II, where we unfortunately wound up with a high debt to GDP ratio. We had no choice. We had to win the war. But even there was a bipartisan consensus in the United States. The way to get the debt GDP ratio down was to grow the economy. We had a Republican, President Eisenhower, who had investments in infrastructure, public investments in infrastructure, education, research, and the debt GDP ratio fell by 2/3 in a relatively short span of time. So that was the right way to do it, not through austerity. So the current framework doesn't focus on the denominator. It doesn't distinguish between spending that is consumption and spending that's investment. And Marco outlined the way that Europe is beginning to think about it and is clearly moving in the right way. Some people would refer to this as the golden rule, and a particular aspect of the golden rule is the green rule that says if we're going to survive, we have to deal with climate change. And if we don't deal with it, there's going to be so much. We're going to be catching up. We're going to, in the United States, we're spending 1.5% to 2% of GDP to deal with the damage from fires, from floods, from hurricanes. Much better to take preventive action and get climate change contained, make those investments. And so that seems to me the right way to go about doing that. So the key thing is that one needs Eurobonds, and one needs more flexibility. One needs more instruments. And the Eurobonds that Europe adopted in the pandemic were an important step forward, but they need to be a permanent part of Europe's fiscal framework. And as Marco emphasized, there needs to be more trust among the countries of Europe that as they face, not just the issue of recovery after the pandemic, but the new crises that will happen, the new shocks that are inevitably going to occur. There has to be trust that Europe will respond to these in a responsible, sustainable way, and a dialogue among the countries and between citizens and their governments and the European leaders and the European Commission about how best to do that.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Joseph. Such clarity, really compelling, and the pillars of a clear framework there. And I guess my first question is partly throwing Joseph's provocation back at you, Marco, and in particular, this idea that actually the core planks of a new framework should sit around this idea of strengthening the automatic stabilizer, building greater discretion into the system, focusing on actually driving growth as a way to balance debt and GDP, and this golden green rule that people are talking about. Do those resonate? What do you see as some of the challenges in the Commission in grappling with those as key tenets of a framework?
Okay, no, thank you very much. It was a pleasure listening to Joe clearly. I think, let me say, first of all, I feel comforted by the fact that, Joe Stiglitz managed to co-author a paper with Bob Rubin. So that makes me very optimistic that we can find an agreement in Europe with on new rules. Because I don't think the gap here between the frugals and the Mediterranean is larger than between you, Joe, and Bob Rubin. Joke apart, but not quite. Now, I think, first of all, yes, crises will come. They will be of different type. I think here Joe would agree that we can transform, nonetheless, some of the unknown unknowns into known unknowns. So if we get, I think, the right and a better understanding, a better economic model of the and in a more multidisciplinary way, because we see on the health side, which were not factored into our model, I think we can it can still be unknowns, but I think we can have a better understanding and transform into known unknowns. So at least we have the compass, a better compass to deal with them. Now, we activated the general escape clause precisely because in the Stability and Growth Pact there is this option in case of large shocks, and that I think helped a lot to trigger the right response on the part of the member states. Now, on automatic stabilizers, I think excellent point. I think this is good. Actually, I have written myself in the past with Vitor Gaspar of the IMF papers actually on strengthening automatic stabilizers, and I think here is that is I think the right way forward, and I think we have learned something in the crisis, because the program SURE that has been one of the initial response, so it is up to 100 billion support to member states via cheap loans to favor short-term work, is actually better than strengthening the unemployment benefits, because you get unemployment benefits once you have lost your job. Whilst here it worked very well to stabilize the labor market and the job market. And actually, if you look at swings in unemployment, Europe actually was in a better place than the US in this, and so as a stopgap, I think that worked very well. And I think on the unemployment benefits, you can certainly work in terms of be more generous at the beginning, whilst in a sense tapering that over time, so that you can provide also better incentive to work. So you can support more in the beginning and then not ending up with unemployment trap over time. Now, I think the issue of the 3 and 60%, that is a classic one. Now, 3 and 60% are in the treaty. I think what is the problem with these numbers, so the Maastricht numerology, is not so much the numbers themselves. Is the reaction function to breaking those numbers that is key. So if in the treaty, these are mentioned as reference values. So yes, I agree with Professor Stiglitz. They do not have a scientific underpinning. It was basically what was the average of the European Union at the time, 3% for the deficit, 60% for the debt. I think what is key is the reaction to breaking those values. So if you take them as a reference value, as an element of assessment of what to do, and look at why they have been broken, is it because of misbehavior? In good times, you spend more than you should instead of creating the room for bad times, or is it because automatic stabilizers because you had a bad shock? So I think it's the assessment of why you have deviated from those that is important rather than the value themselves. I have to say, you need, for Europe, you need to change the treaty, you need unanimity, you need to go for ratification in parliaments, you want to change fundamentally that. The question is that, is it something that on which in the present juncture we should invest our political capital? It's a question that I leave there for discussion. I think, yes, trust is absolutely key. Why did we react, I think, in a different way now from what we did during the financial crisis? I think there are a number of reasons. I think we know much more about, I think we have a better understanding of the macroeconomic and macroeconomic policies. I think we have also the issue of the policy mix with a constrained monetary policy, which needs to be supported by fiscal policies. But one of the reasons, I think, is the different nature of the crisis. Let me say something that is, I mean, a little bit provocative. Had the financial crisis in Europe and the sovereign debt crisis not started with the massive Greek cheating on the statistics, which created a very bad environment and the mistrust we are trying to avoid now, I think the management of the crisis would have been a different one in Europe. The fact that we started with that, it was a fiscal crisis, was based on cheating on the numbers, I think created a kind of rejection that I think we affected then the narrative of the crisis going forward. You come to the pandemic, it is clear that you do not have an issue of moral hazard here. Okay, one could have said, yes, you could have had more room for maneuver had you behaved better in better times, but it's a criticism that did not hold water and was clearly overcome. So I think that is what I think is in a sense affected the type of reaction. There is one very, very final point, 1 second, is that there is a division in Europe between frugals and the Mediterraneans. We know these divisions here, creditors and debtors, etc. On Next Generation EU, so the common response to the crisis, which led to transfer to member states, those more in troubles, the issuance of the safe asset that Professor Stiglitz talked about. If you look at Eurobarometer and ask the public opinion, the differentiation between countries is much lower than between governments. So the acceptance that Europe has a responsibility to actually provide a common response to provide also a common response on the health side, the vaccination, the common procurement. I think we have, after the initial hiccups and criticisms, we have been vindicated big time on having a joint strategy on vaccination and on procurement. I think we on that. I think we have done I think much better than what people acknowledged in the first place. So I think opening up our doors, civil society, etc., creating this awareness, I think creates more ownership, understanding, mutual togetherness, which I think would then force also the governments to acknowledge and discuss in a non-ideological manner on these matters.
Thank you very much. I'm going to throw a question at you, Joseph, but I will also give you the right to respond to some of the provocations provided by Marco as well. And, you know, whether you have a different analysis, for example, of the response to the financial crisis and whether there was a moral hazard question that determined the course of action and something different could have happened. But my question to you is, I think one of the big themes that's come out of this week of conversation and debate that we've had is that the fiscal rules, however arbitrary, but the kind of framework and thinking around the fiscal rules and the assumptions were designed almost absent of environmental breakdown. And there is now broad consensus that we are now in a point of environmental breakdown. Do you think that that requires us to fundamentally rethink the sort of parameters of that? And is your sense that actually there is the beginnings of that debate amongst policymakers?
Well, let me say that growth, the environment is not the only problem. Europe has had slow growth. It's had growing inequality, not as bad as the United States, but still growing inequality. I think that there has been excessive fiscal constraints, even if there were not an environmental crisis. But that, of course, makes it absolutely compelling to do something, to go beyond and to recognize the distinction between consumption and investment. Now, I don't know, I don't pretend to be a legal expert and to know whether, I think the point that Marco made that changing the legal framework of Europe is very difficult. But a lot of people have said that you could at least change interpretation. They said within the framework, you could have a golden rule where you exempted investment, or you had particularly a green rule that you exempted investment on environmental projects would be consistent with Maastricht. As I say, I'm not a lawyer and I don't know whether that's the case. If you can't, then it is compelling to change the rules. But if it can, then obviously you need to change the interpretation of those rules. I think that also the point that Marco made, the key issue is how you respond to the breaking of the rules. And if you're broken those rules to make investments, to address these key issues, then the attitude should be markedly different than as you have a consumption binge. And then I want to echo the issue of trust. In the case of Greece, and I have to respond a little bit to you said the provocation. Greece's government, the new government at that time, was the one who went to the EU and said, look, our previous government had manipulated the books. And, we understand, but we are now in a crisis. You can't, at that point, it had been honest. The Papandreou government had been honest about the situation. And, it's like you have a kid and he's misbehaved and he comes forward and says, okay, I misbehaved. What do? You have to say, okay, now we have enough trust in each other that we have to go forward. And, we wish we weren't here in this position, but we have to deal with reality that we've been dealt with. In the case of Spain, Portugal, and Ireland, they had actually had more than met the fiscal constraints. They had a low deficit GDP ratio, and yet Europe acted and imposed austerity on those countries. And so I hope that that is the lesson that Europe has learned from the 2010 crisis. And that's why I feel so hopeful about Europe, because they did issue the Euro bonds. And there was that kind of trust. But now the challenge is to say, can we generalize this? Is it only on these extreme situations of a pandemic? Or is it more general that, in fact, that we're going to be buffeted by lots of events beyond our control? And we want, and I really want to echo what Marco said, we know a lot of things. We can learn about more things. We can use what we know to create better automatic stabilizers, to do better jobs I certainly second what Europe did in trying to keep people in the job rather than dealing with unemployment after they lost the job. That was really a smart way of dealing with the problems. We can use the knowledge that we have to design better policy responses to the shocks that we face.
Thank you. I'm going to raise to both of you a question that's been raised by a colleague in the audience, and then follow up with, if you like, two different halves of another question from me, if I may. So Renz asks, can countries with debt over 100% of GDP really grow out of this, even if they accept all kinds of reforms, given secular stagnation and the green transition? So we'd be interested in both your takes on that challenge that will increasingly be a challenge faced by quite a number of countries. And then sort of my kind of follow on from that is, we know everything we've learned from the financial crisis is that we did see permanent scarring across European economies. The IMF has done its regional forecasts, which suggests that we're likely to see scarring coming out of the pandemic. Should public investment be raised to reach previous trend growth? That's a question for you, Marco. And then the sort of flip side of that question, Joseph, is when is the right time for fiscal consolidation? Is there ever a right time? Marco, perhaps if we start with you.
Okay. No, thank you very much. On public debt, I think here I beg a bit to differ from Professor Stiglitz. I think he would only go through the denominator. I think we cannot do that. And what if you cannot only do that, let's say. I think what you have also reminiscences of the 1950s after the war, etc. It was strong growth, absolutely. It was strong nominal growth also, with outbursts of inflation, which actually helped a lot to bring the debt down. We are not going to have that now, given the right overall macroeconomic framework that we have. So I think we certainly need to work via the denominator, and we need to work via the numerator. The numerator means that when the time is right, precisely because we have increased the gradients between the effectiveness of automatic stabilizers, it means they work better, they are more effective in bad times. They are also more effective in good times. So if we have a strong recovery, we should see actually the deficit coming down also. So there is a numerator, denominator. I think when the time is ripe we will have to, I think, work on both. Clearly, we have to get it right on the exit strategy. I think here we have to look at the perspective, I think, is the policy mix, not only the fiscal. I think here what has been decided in Europe already is that the general escape clause that has suspended the adjustment or rules under the Stability and Growth Pact will be in force this year and the next, so also 2022. And I think, let's say, barring other, unexpected shocks, for what we know now, actually the recovery is better than expected. At least the bouncing back is better than expected. I think it's not a full recovery yet. I think we have to support that with the right macroeconomic policies, including fiscal policy. Then looking forward, I think it would be important to behave also on the public deficit and bringing them to more sustainable levels. And I think we have public debt in average during the pandemic has gone up by, as you see in my slide, by 15 points. Actually, in some countries more. I think it would be important to do that. To put it on a downwards trajectory in a gradual, let's say, soft and gentle manner. Let's put it like that. And I don't think that having a proper and prudent fiscal policy means austerity per se. So I think you can be done by behaving and helping out on that front. And I think the question will be not only of the quantity but also the quality. So easing the transition, and also what I dubbed there the vertical coordination. What I think can be done at the European level, what should be done at the national level. And now, for instance, every time there is a pronouncement on fiscal policy by Christine Lagarde, she actually stresses very much the role of fiscal policy in helping the monetary policy to deliver on the price stability objectives. So they need they need the support. Now let me just one final thing again, a comment on Joe's point on the program countries. I mean, you mentioned countries. Actually, we had that. Okay, we have that troubled history with Greece. I think fair enough. If you take now ex post the other countries which had to undergo programs, Spain was essentially on the financial side, the banking system. You had Ireland, you had, but also Cyprus. You have Portugal. I mean, you look at the growth, post-program growth of these countries compared to the EU average, compared to the best in the EU, they have actually been a spectacular success. I think the ownership of the program, the fact that they implemented the reform which is absolutely needed, stabilize the financial system, I think was key to make this a success. So I would not agree with portraying what we did through the financial crisis as an unmitigated failure. I think all the other countries, so N-1 were great success. Then you have Greece, which was an issue apart. I mean, with a post-mortem on that, I think we could definitely have done, I think, a better job. But in those circumstances, I think with the existential crisis we went through without the compass that I think we should have now, I think we, at least for those countries, I think we managed to operate them in a reasonably positive manner. I think there is allegedly, I think, and I fully agree, what we have done in response to the pandemic, speed, forcefulness, the Next Generation EU breaking taboos, crossing very deep red lines with the safe assets, with an important program at the European level is clearly much better than what we did before.
Thank you. Joseph.
Yeah. So first, let me say that when you operate on the denominator by increasing growth, it actually benefits the numerator. And the government gets about, depending on your tax system in the United States, about 20% of the growth in increment in GDP goes into tax revenue. So well-designed policies to promote growth, increasing the denominator, actually improve the numerator at the same time. And at the same time, those policies that were focused on austerity, that were focused on reducing the numerator, tended to destroy the denominator, and Greece is the worst example of that. And the result of that is the denominator got a little bit smaller, but the numerator got so much, the numerator got a little smaller, but the denominator got so much smaller that the debt GDP ratio got actually worsened. So it's really where your focus is. Your focus should be, I think, on how do you promote economic growth. And while structural reforms are obviously important, so is the macroeconomic framework. The question mentioned secular stagnation. I've always been skeptical of that notion. Secular stagnation is a suggestion that somehow the economy has entered a phase in which it cannot grow. And I think the problem after 2008 was that we didn't have enough fiscal support. We relied on monetary policy. And as Marco pointed out, Christine Lagarde and actually central bankers in the United States have emphasized there's a limit to what monetary policy can do. We needed in 2008 and 2010 to have had more fiscal support. And I think the really good thing about the pandemic is that we actually recognized that monetary policy was not going to be our salvation, and we had to have strong fiscal policy support. And it's clear in the United States that that fiscal policy is beginning really to pay off with the prospects that the strong fiscal support, well designed, may actually lead us to have a higher growth, a higher level of GDP than we thought before the pandemic. So that restructuring our policies can actually make a difference. Now, I agree absolutely that we ought to think more carefully about both expenditure and tax policies. And in the United States, I think our framework has too low of a tax GDP ratio. We could have a better economy by raising taxes and investing more in our country. And I think, we're extreme, but I think Europe also has more scope for that. And when I say we could raise taxes to create a more equitable and a more efficient and more environmentally friendly economy. So we can raise environmental tax. I think Europe has discussed in the past financial transaction tax, encouraging more investment in real productive activity than in financial sector, capital gains on land. No economy became prosperous as a result of real estate speculation. The people at the top in the United States pay a tax rate of 8%, whereas people below pay obviously a much higher tax rate. Corporations are engaged in tax avoidance, which interferes with economic efficiency. And that's why the proposed G20 reform of a minimum tax is really important. So there are a whole host of ways in which we could raise taxes and improve the numerator. And some of those Europe is actually discussing, like a digital tax, but I think there are a lot more that ought to be on the table. Again, talking about the United States, I don't want to, I believe we can do also better on the expenditure side. We have a defense expenditures that have a lot of weapons that don't work against enemies that don't exist. We have new defense needs having to do with cybersecurity, and our defense expenditures have not adapted to the 21st century. So again, lots of things that we could do that to improve the numerator, and I would support taking those actions. On the question of when is the right time for consolidation, I think the real point here is we're not out of the woods yet. There's been scarring. We don't know we first of all, we haven't gotten really over the pandemic yet. In the US, we're losing more than 2,000 people dying a day. We have a distinctive problem because somehow we politicized vaccinations, and we have a real problem of vaccine resistance, even though we have a supply. Developing countries, emerging markets, it's a supply problem. In the United States, it's quite the opposite. It's ample supply. Government pays for it all. It's just that there's vaccine resistance. And we won't control the economic fallout of the pandemic until we control the pandemic. So we have to admit it's another one of those unknowns. We don't know how long this is going to last. But once we get over the pandemic, then we have to assess the nature of the scarring. I'm actually optimistic. I think the economy is going to bounce back quite strongly if we succeed, if the Biden administration succeeds in getting past its infrastructure bill and its family cares bill. But if we don't, I think that we may actually have, like we did after 2008, a slow recovery, and that would make fiscal consolidation very difficult.
Fantastic point to end on. Can I just say a huge thank you to both of you. You have definitely done the job of provoking us, stimulating us, but giving us some big themes to chew upon, but hopefully that is the start of this very important conversation that needs to happen. I know that colleagues in the second panel will no doubt be taking some of the themes and the provocations and questions that you've raised, but also actually some of the clarity around a potential framework and a way forward that I think you have sort of given us over the course of this part of the discussion. So thank you very much from me. Thank you from all of our partners for taking part in this conversation. We hope this is the beginning of it rather than the end of it. And I'll hand over to my colleague, Lydia.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Miata, and thank you once again, Marco Busi and Joseph Stiglitz, for a really interesting discussion. We all really appreciate you giving up your time to speak with us today. We're going to continue this discussion by moving on to a panel discussion. My name's Lydia Prieg, and I'm Head of Economics at the New Economics Foundation, and we're going to be hearing from 4 panelists, Dominika Bigon, Steve Keen, Philip Heinberger, and Aurora Leluc, who are all going to be giving us their opinion on what a new European fiscal framework should look like, and really crucially, how do we actually get there? And then I'm going to ask a few follow-up questions probably before we throw this open to questions from you guys. So please do, throughout the discussion, keep putting your questions in the chat and we'll pick them up later on in the proceedings. So first of all, I'd like to introduce Dominika Bigon, who's a member of the European Economic and Social Committee and head of the European and International Economic Policy at the Federal Executive Board of the German Trade Union Confederation. Dominika.
Thank you very much, Lydia, for the introduction. Let me start by saying that I really enjoyed the talk by Marco Butti and Stieglitz, because it was very interesting that they came from very different viewpoints, from the point of the practitioner and the scientists, and they still converged on certain points, which I found very interesting. And these points are to strengthen automatic stabilizers, to focus on a growth strategy in order to deal with the higher debt to GDP ratios in the near future, and also the need for strengthening the quality of public expenditure by increasing public investments in order to manage the green transition. And I think I will talk from the viewpoint of the practitioner here. And my main observation is that the reform of the fiscal rules is currently discussed very ideologically. So we have the fiscal hawks on the one side who are already flapping their wings, who are shocked by the rise of debt to GDP ratio because of the corona crisis, who want to introduce the fiscal rules, reintroduce the fiscal rules rather today than tomorrow, and who even want to enforce them more effectively in the future. And then on the other hand, we have others, maybe also including myself, but certainly other trade union colleagues, who would like to scrap the fiscal rulebook altogether, who refer to the favorable interest environment at the moment, who do not see any problems with rising public expenditure, and who criticize also very fundamentally the strong focus of the EU treaties on fiscal sustainability, which goes at the expense of environmental sustainability, of employment, and social cohesion. I mean, this was already mentioned completely at the beginning. My main argument, however, is that what we really need is more pragmatism in the discussion of how to reform the EU fiscal rules. I mean, let's be realistic. Yeah, we trade unions see many deficiencies with the EU fiscal rule book, but a treaty change is not realistic in the near future. And I also do not see political majorities for a general overhaul of the fiscal rules. So I would really like to propose the same reforms as Joseph Stiglitz has proposed, but I think critically saying they are not viable at the moment. They are politically not viable at the moment. And so the only option we really have is to look for pragmatic solutions. We have to define what are the most pressing problems. We have to define them very specifically and look for pragmatic solutions for these very specific problems. And I am a member, as Lydia said, I am a member of the European Economic and Social Committee, which is a consultative body of the EU institutions, where social partners and other civil society organizations come together and propose common standpoints. And we are in the process of finalizing a report on the reform of the fiscal rules. And we have also commissioned a study, a joint endeavor by legal scientists and economists, which will be published in November, and where we really sketch out concrete pragmatic solutions for reform of the fiscal rules. And I will present them here mainly. So what are the main pressing problems, and what pragmatic solutions do trade unions propose? Yeah, the first really and the most important pressing problem is the chronic lack of public investments. I mean, it is well known the current rules are not fit to master the green transition. We have immense investment needs, and there are an abundance of studies in the meantime now who can really quantify the investment needs. And even according to conservative estimations, and here I refer to a new Bruegel study, we will need an increase of public spending of 100 billion per year in the EU. And this is simply not manageable with the existing EU fiscal framework. And one could argue, okay, but now we have the Recovery and Resilience Facility. Green investments will be financed in the near future by this new fund. But the problem is, and this is also what Marco Butti said, it is a temporary instrument. And secondly, it is simply not enough. New figures show that even with the RRF, we will not reach the investment level we had before the financial crisis. So the RRF will simply only help to cushion the most dramatic reductions of public investment, but it will not help to really turn the tide and to help strengthening public investments in the mid to longer term. So that is why we trade unions, we demand both. We need the RRF, and in addition to this, we need a golden rule of public investments, which needs to be introduced in the EU fiscal rulebook in order to allow member states to finance net public investments by issuing debt. The second pressing problem that I see are the debt reduction path that is foreseen in the six-pack. And this is something that is not enshrined in primary law. It is something that can be changed by secondary law in ordinary legislative procedure. Member states with a debt to GDP ratio over 60% have to reduce this debt by 1/20 every year. And we trade unions are not alone in our view, saying that this debt reduction path will overburden many member states, especially those member states with a debt to GDP ratio higher than 100%. So the European Fiscal Board has calculated that a country like Italy would need a primary budget surplus of 3% in the next 10 years. I mean, this is absolutely not manageable. It would be an immense effort. It would have very damaging consequences, and a decade of austerity would start again. And in a recent hearing I had with Business Europe, even Business Europe was acknowledging that something has to be done with this 1/20th rule. And we trade unions suggest that the six-pack legislation is changed, that we integrate more flexibility, that we allow a longer debt adjustment path, in particular for those countries with high debt levels, and we propose a more country-specific differentiation of debt reduction paths. And then the third problem is the problem of pro-cyclicality. The existing routes tend to be pro-cyclical. We have massive economic downturns. We have the exceptional clauses, but the fiscal rules are not fit to deal with minor cyclical fluctuations. And here, it is a rather technical issue, but the problem is really the structural balance rule and how the potential output is calculated. I'm sure Philipp Heinberger will talk more about this, which is why I will not go into detail. But what we suggest is that the structural balance rule is abolished in favor of an expenditure rule, which leaves automatic stabilizers to work freely, or to radically change the calculation of the potential output and make it less sensitive to cyclical fluctuations. So all these reform proposals I have sketched out here can be done within the existing treaties. No treaty change is necessary. It could all be implemented by changing secondary legislation or even only by interpreting existing legislation more flexibly. And I hope that this pragmatic approach can really build a bridge between political camps. And at least within the European Economic and Social Committee, as I said, we are in the process of finalizing an opinion with the employers which goes along these lines. One final point remains, which I want at least to mention, and this is also something that has been raised by Marco Butti, and this is about the issue on fiscal governments. Nothing will change if we improve the rules, but do not improve implementation. In the past, fiscal rules have not been implemented effectively. And in order to improve this, we need to improve ownership. At the moment, there is no ownership of the EU fiscal rules on the national level because the European semester is rather a very technocratic procedure where neither the European Parliament nor the national parliament nor the social partners have a say. Yeah, and this has to change radically. How we spend public money is one of the most political questions we have, and this is why it has to be decided on in the political sphere. And therefore, the European Parliament needs to be involved, national parliaments needs to be involved, and also the social partners need to be involved in the European semester. And I argue that we need both. We need a democratization of the EU fiscal framework, both in order to improve the legitimacy of the rules, but also to improve effectiveness, to increase ownership. I think I leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Monica. We're going to move on to Steve Keen now, who's a Minsky University College London Honorary Research Fellow and author of the book Debunking Economics. You can follow his Patreon page if you look up Prof. Steve Keen, and he'll also be running for election in Australia for a new political party called the New Liberals. Steve.
Thank you. I'll just quickly, I want to show something which I think puts Marco and Joe on the same page, because I very much agreed with Joe's approach to looking at the fiscal rules in Europe over Marco's, but neither of them talked about the level of private debt. And I wanted to show just what an omission that is, simply even in empirical levels. This is the Bank of International Settlements record for the level of government debt and private debt in the euro. And here we are worrying about the one that's lower than the one above. There's an obsession in mainstream economics with public debt and completely ignoring the level of private debt. But if you look through all the countries of the euro, and I'll go through a couple of them here, you find that almost exclusively private debt far exceeds government debt, and the ups and downs of private debt have got far more to do with the performance of the economy than what happens with government debt. And the most outrageous example there is one we've been talking a bit about today, which is Spain. And if I just get my mouse to behave properly, I'll just jump past Saudi Arabia here to Spain. Okay, this is what Spain was lauded for, reducing its level of government debt from the beginning of the euro through to the beginning of the crisis. It was pretty much the only country in Europe that actually achieved what the rules tried to set out. At the same time, there was an enormous bubble in private debt, which took it to astronomical levels. And when you look at the rate of change of that debt, which I define credit as the rate of change of private debt, it peaked at over 30% of GDP and it plunged to minus 20% during the crisis. Now, that's what caused the crisis. So we're obsessing about government debt when it's private debt and private credit that determine what happens with the economy. And the other thing, which in this case I'm definitely going to be agreeing with Joe, is that we have a set of rules about how to manage the European system, which presume that government debt's the problem. And when you look at the accounting involved, and this is what I'm doing here with my software package Minsky, and seeing what actually happens, simply laying out the structure of financial flows between the public sector, the banking sector, and the government, you find that the problem is not government debt at all, because what government debt is selling bonds to cover a deficit. Now, firstly, rather than the deficit encumbering current and future generations, which is the way it's perceived in mainstream thinking, the deficit adds money to the private sector by putting money in private bank accounts, and it adds excess reserves to the banking sector at the same time. And then when the bonds are sold by the Treasury, the bonds are actually financed by the deficit. In fact, what's going on is you're giving the banks an offer that says, would you like to convert those non-tradable, non-income earning assets we've created for you called reserves into tradable income earning assets? The normal answer from the financial sector is yes, please. And anybody who doesn't say it is turning down a free lunch. I've never seen anybody in finance turn down an expensive one when somebody else is paying, let alone a free one for themselves at a later stage. So simply looking at the accounting flows tells us the rules that back the euro are a joke. They should not be there. They're based on a misunderstanding of government finance, and the sooner we get rid of them, the better. The trouble is, as I think we saw from Marco's performance, once you get dedicated to a set of insane rules, it's your role to try to maintain those over time. And it simply makes a mockery of managing an economy. I'm going to get slightly more complicated here, actually a lot more complicated. How do because we had a lot of talk there about reducing debt by growing the economy faster than we grow the level of debt. And this is a more complicated model, as I think you can tell, that shows that if you have an economy like the American economy with a substantial level of private debt, you can actually reduce that debt by a jubilee. And the jubilee itself will, because it actually does partly what Joe was talking about, it increases the level of GDP by effectively distributing money from the wealthy to the poor. The poor spend more, by the distribution of money itself, without even creating any additional money, you stimulate the economy and end up reducing the level of private debt and government debt by running a jubilee, writing the debt off rather than trying to pay it off, which is the obsession of the European Union, or rather than trying to grow the economy more rapidly without addressing the level of private debt in the first instance. So what we have is a failure to think properly. And that, unfortunately, I think is going to dominate the euro. There's a way out of this, but it involves breaking out of the mindset of conventional economics. And I think it's been 50 years fighting it. I don't like our chances of breaking out of it until it breaks us.
Thank you very much, Steve. And just a reminder to everyone to do keep putting your questions in the chat as we go along, and we will pick them up later on. We're now going to move on to Philipp Heinberger, who's an economist from the Vienna Institute for International Economic Studies. Philipp.
Hello, thanks a lot for inviting me. Well, also after the discussion with Booty and Stiglitz, let me maybe start by saying, yes, we should not return to the pre-pandemic fiscal rules. I think I can also say that on behalf of the younger people in the room. But as Dominika has also stressed, we need to be aware that while there is a strong agreement on this on our panel, there are strong players in Europe with a very different view. And so the question is, what does this tell us for a roadmap on reforming the fiscal rules, right? So yes, a quick move towards fiscal tightening promoted by applying the framework we currently have would be counterproductive, and we need to acknowledge that there's a real risk of fiscal policy basically doing too little over the years to come, especially when it comes to public investment. And as Booty has also stressed, the macroeconomic conditions today are very different from what they were when the youth fiscal rules were introduced, in particular when you look at the very low interest rates for long. So you can make the case that the rules are obsolete. But still, we are living in a world of politics in which there is no consensus on how to move forward with the fiscal rules. That's the status quo. And this brings me to my first major point, which is that it's crucial to build a European intellectual consensus on what we want to achieve with the reform of the EU fiscal rules before we decide on the plumbing, on the technical details. And I think that's what the next couple of months should primarily be about. Last time there were major changes to the fiscal rules after the financial crisis. There was a broad consensus about the direction. So the six-pack legislation was basically based on a broad political consensus that fiscal policies should become more prudent and austere. And we also discussed this today. I think there's very good evidence that this was a major mistake back then. So we should now strive to build a consensus that fiscal policy will need to be more active going forward, especially in terms of stabilizing the business cycle and in terms of promoting green public investment. So here are two priorities as I see them. I think it's important to talk about priorities because it won't be possible to address everything to the same extent. Stiglitz also stressed this point. We won't be able to write down everything, and there are trade-offs. And Marco Booty also said that it's important to think about where to actually use the political capital the Commission and also the member states have. So I think the two priorities should be, we need to get rid of the pro-cyclicality that is inherent in the current framework to make sure that applying the rules does not deepen future crises. And the second priority, I think, should be that we need to make sure that all governments can do all the major public investment that will be required over the years and decades to come to meet ambitious climate goals. And this is absolutely crucial to ensure debt sustainability in the future as well. I think that's the goals we should prioritize, and the plumbing, the technical details should be set in order to reach these goals. If we achieve that by tweaking the current framework, moving to an expenditure rule, or by introducing something else is an important technical question, but it should be assessed against the basis of whether it reaches the objectives we actually set out and on which we should try to build a consensus. However, building intellectual consensus on what we want to achieve, from which a political consensus can then follow, may take much longer than a couple of months. So that's kind of a note of caution I want to make. This might actually be difficult to do within a couple of months or over the course of 2022, given that the discussions will be very, very difficult. So in the meantime, we may need quick fixes. to avoid basically falling off a cliff in 2023 or 2024. My second major point is the following. What's going to be very important, I think, in terms of whether we implement reforms that allow us to move towards achieving the goals that I set out, is the new German coalition treaty, and who's going to be finance minister and chancellor in Germany. This is going to be important given the high weight of Germany in political discussions and signaling effects for other member countries. It's also essential given that we already have an alliance of so-called frugal countries, including my home country, Austria, which have come out arguing that the current EU fiscal regulation framework is consistent with what they call efficient fiscal policy, and there's little need to change. So whether the next German government actually sits silently without any initiative to promote sensible reforms on its own, thereby essentially supporting the frugal countries, or whether it makes an active case for why reforms in the right direction are needed, this will make a big difference. As we also saw last year in the discussions over Next Generation EU, that the German position can be very important. And against the background of the importance of Germany's position and the position of the so-called frugal countries, let me say that the political constellation, as I see it, essentially rules out that we can find consensus within just a couple of months on very far-reaching changes to the existing framework, including treaty changes. This means that we may need quick fixes, and this implies that the technical details in the current framework, which could be tweaked to allow for moving towards the objectives of getting rid of pro-cyclicality and pushing for more investment, these technical details will gain in importance. So let me come to my last major point, given all this, which is about the question, what could changes in the existing framework look like that have a substantial impact on fiscal policy in the right direction? Here I will echo also important points that were made by Dominika Bigon already. I think first we need to revisit the numbers which drive the operational aspects of fiscal policy in the current rules. At the very least, we need macroeconomically more plausible, better estimates of the output gap, which is the estimate that is crucial in the current rules for judging how much underutilization of economic resources there is in an economy and how large the structural component of the budget deficit is, which is essential for assessing compliance of member countries with the medium-term budgetary targets in the current rules. And I would argue that systematically biased estimates of the output gap have in the past promoted pro-cyclical fiscal policies, pushing several member countries into deeper and prolonged crises, with negative effects also for employment and debt sustainability. So reviewing the calculation of the output gap is crucial in reviewing and revisiting the preventive arm of the Stability and Growth Pact. And doing so could also create sizable fiscal space for many member countries going forward. And let me come to my last point, which is that the COVID-19 crisis led to a steep increase in public debt to GDP ratios, which we also already discussed. And sticking with the existing debt reduction rule would push countries into very long counterproductive austerity mode, which is also unnecessary given the low interest rate environment and the corresponding decline in government interest payments. So therefore, we could replace the current debt reduction rule with a smaller reduction requirement and a longer adjustment horizon. I think we should acknowledge that reducing the public debt to GDP ratio should not be an end in itself, and it must be weighted also against other important fiscal policy goals, in particular supporting a socially balanced climate transition and moving towards full employment. So my conclusion, my last point is, although treaty changes are unlikely, there's still a lot we can do. There's a lot we can do with the interpretive powers of the European Commission and also with changes in secondary legislation. And we should go for this and really try to move towards the goals that I set out. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much. We're now going to move on to our final panelist, Aurora Leluc, who's a member of the European Parliament and a member of the Committee on Economic and Monetary Affairs. Aurora.
Hi, Lydia. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for the invitation. It was so good to hear you all. Dominika, I fully agree with everything that you said. Philip also, and John said to say a word on Steve Keen. It was so good to hear someone to talk about private debt and Minsky. So thank you. I'm gonna focus not on what we can do, the golden rule, the tax reform and so on, but about perhaps what we should do. And as some of you already mentioned, implementing a new fiscal framework in Europe is key, because Europe remains, I think, the only monetary zone in the world with no tax system, no own resources, and no real budget. And if we, and I think we have to realize how crazy the situation is, especially when you are an economist by training. This is just crazy. So let's go back to basic. First, a currency cannot operate without a real fiscal support, and it cannot operate properly with the fiscal rules that we have in Europe today, namely the 3% and the 60%. Let's not forget, by the way, because I know that Germany is often criticized, that this number we are talking about and we are obsessed with were in fact invented by a French bureaucrat, not German, a French bureaucrat, who later admitted to have come up with this number completely randomly. Second, macroeconomic policy, in order to be effective, needs to be flexible. Most importantly, it cannot rely on few rules set in stone and never to be argued about. And the best illustration for this is that every time we hit a crisis, every time fiscal rules have to be lifted, because the priority can no longer be the reduction of deficits, but the support to the economy. And I'm sorry to say that a rule that is designed to be intangible, but that it is always suspended in time of a crisis, is a bad rule. And it means that it is neither relevant nor efficient. Third, we need to implement the green transition. This transition will require us to invest more than ever in the past. According to the European Court of Auditors itself, we will need to invest over 1.0 trillion euros every year between 2020 and 2030 in order to achieve our climate goal. And obviously, there is no way we can reach that goal without a fully functioning macroeconomic area. And this number that is already quite big doesn't even take into account our needs in terms of education, healthcare, transport, and so on. And even a rich country like Germany, in Germany, the need for infrastructure investment is gigantic. It's like 200 billion per year, if I had a good memory. So for all of this reason, returning to the outdated rules would obviously be a political mistake and have some dramatic impact on the Europeans. Let's be honest, even if we have really a fantastic commissioner that is Paolo Gentiloni, and he has a goodwill, I'm not sure that we are going to have a very ambitious reform at the European level. And even if we have this kind of fiscal reform some of us are dreaming about, I think it will not be enough to achieve the level of investments that we need. Because the problem that we have in Europe with investment is not a problem of means, it's a problem of will, of political will, actually. And the fiscal rules are working more like, I would say, a political or dogmatic lock than a real legislative constraint. Let's not forget that for years, interest rates have been extremely low, sometimes negative for some countries, but it did not result in a massive level of investment from European countries. In fact, it has mostly increase the prices of assets. So if by allowing European states to contract a common debt, the RRF was definitely a step in the right direction, we still have a long way to go if you want to be able to act and react on a macroeconomic level with the same ambition as the US. Let's not forget that unlike the US, the Eurozone does not have a wide range of tools to implement quick and effective policy. And I think that we can say that today Europe is a giant with the tools of a child, actually. It used to be an infant. Now Europe is a toddler, start working. It's better, of course, but it's still not enough. Therefore, reforming fiscal rules at the European level is a first step, necessary, but it won't be enough. What we need is a shift in the ideology that governs our policy, and of course, a complete reform of our institutional framework. We need a tax system, a real budget. We also need to rethink the way our monetary policy works. We need a central bank that is allowed to support the economy directly with the helicopter money, for instance, and whose goals is not only price stability, but also full employment, prosperity, and green transition. And the problem today that we are asking, as Joe Stiglitz said, actually, we're asking too much to the European Central Bank, that is our only federal actor in Europe. And we need now to help the European bank with central bank, with a budget. All of this will require us to take a federal leap. There is no choice, I think, and to renew our institution. And of course, the first step will be to have a powerful European Parliament. Thank you to all of you.
Thank you very much, Aurora, and to all our panelists. I'm going to start by asking a few questions of my own. So first of all, because we heard from Joe Stiglitz in his opening remarks, he talked about how trying to write a set of rules that covers every possible eventuality is fundamentally just, showing a lack of trust in the member states. So, and instead we need to allow some element of discretion. So my first question is, in a new EU fiscal framework, how much discretion do we think member states should have? And could you help us, have an idea of what exactly that discretion should look like? I'm very happy for any member of the panel to jump in if they're particularly keen to answer that.
I can say a word on this. I think it was very important to stress this lack of trust, which also kind of directly affected the policy approach, especially during the Euro crisis, and which also in part led to the reforms of the fiscal rules after the financial crisis, by basically making the Stability and Growth Pact stricter and also introducing the six-pack legislation. What I stressed is that there is this pro-cyclical element in the current fiscal framework, which means that when countries are in crisis, basically what they can do in terms of fiscal policy is taken away from them, also after crises. And this obviously also takes away the discretion they have. Yeah? And that also is a problem to some extent from a democratic point of view, because obviously if you are in a prolonged crisis and policymakers are unable to come up also with solutions with fiscal policy that can support economic recovery and improvements on the labor market, that also leads to problems in terms of output legitimacy. So kind of improving the framework in terms of getting rid of this pro-cyclicality would be, I think, a big step forward.
Thank you very much. Dominika, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Yes, I would like to jump on this. Yeah, I also found it very interesting that what Marco Butti said and his lack of trust and that he senses throughout Europe. And I can, as a German, I can really underline this, that lack of trust is really a problem, and the fear of moral hazard and so on. And this leads also some economists at the moment to demand that fiscal policy should be delegated to experts more. Yeah, that the European Fiscal Board or national fiscal boards should have a stronger say on the fiscal stance of the fiscal policy of the member states. And the motivation, I understand the logic behind this. Yeah, the idea is to make fiscal policy less ideological and more science-based, but the flip side of it is that you again pretend as if you can delegate fiscal policy to an independent institution. You cannot delegate it as you delegate monetary policy to the ECB. It is a completely different policy field. Even with monetary policy, it is difficult. But fiscal policy has massive redistributive effects. So we need to put all the fiscal policy back in the political area. And for this, more political discretion is absolutely necessary. But if you have more political discretion on the side of the Commission, then you also need, then it's even more important that you increase the role of the European Parliament and the national parliament to hold executives in check. Yeah, this would be my answer to this.
Perfect. Thank you very much. So another question, because obviously certain northern countries have benefited from having a devalued currency because of the southern economies, and in turn some southern economies have had an overvalued currency, and obviously that has implications on all these countries' finances. What do you think should be done about that, or can be done about that? Philip or Dominika, feel free to jump in.
Yeah, I mean, I can say a word on this. Obviously, that's one of the problems we have in the public debate, and also in terms of statements made by politicians, which also kind of is not helpful when it comes to building trust, when you kind of always point a finger at certain countries and do not acknowledge that there are also structural asymmetries within, especially the monetary union. I think one solution is we need to go out and improve the public debate. Also, that's a little bit what I have been trying to do. Try to explain to people in Germany, for example, that Italy is not a basket case, that as it is often portrayed also in German media, but also in Austrian media and in other countries, tell them that Italy consistently ran primary fiscal surpluses over decades, and this has not necessarily been good for public debt sustainability, and there needs to be a better mix of policy. So I think, yeah, we also have a responsibility to improve the quality of the public debate, because this also has implications for policy decisions that are being taken, if we take seriously that the trust issue is especially important. I mean, we need to coordinate economic policies, and especially fiscal policies, given that we have also a set of common institutions, and that certainly is complexity in Europe. But that would be at least part of my answer to this, kind of also try to improve the public debate.
Dominika, do you have anything you'd like to add?
No, I think my answer would go in the same direction. I fear that we do not have enough controversy on this panel. I mean, macroeconomic imbalances here again. I mean, we have the macroeconomic imbalance procedure, which is rather binding. I mean, the European Commission could impose sanctions on Germany for its imbalance and the current account surpluses. But I think this is also the wrong way to go. Yeah, I mean, it is macroeconomic imbalances have to be dealt with on the national level. The European level can to a certain extent put pressure on national actors, but it is the role of trade unions in Germany really to point out that more public investments is necessary, to convince public political actors on the national level, and that higher wage growth is absolutely necessary for the economy. But it's not something that can be done by imposing sanctions or by having like a technocratic macroeconomic imbalance procedure. I see the responsibility on the national level with especially also with trade unions on the national level.
And what about things like the recovery and resilience facility? Like, should that become permanent?
To me, I have a strong opinion. I mean, of course, it is. I agree. I think all of the panelists would agree that it is a really, really important step in the right direction, and in a step, especially as far as strengthening public investments is concerned. I mean, there were different budgetary instruments in the discussion in the last years by the European Commission, and I'm quite happy that this instrument now focuses on public investments. But the governments of the Recovery and Resilience Facility, we trade unions in Germany see quite critical, and there has to be a lot of construction sites are there, mainly because it is linked to the European semester. The European semester has proposes country-specific recommendations, which again are decided on in an undemocratic way. And now the European Commission has more power to impose these structural reforms. We trade unions do not know what might be the output of this. Yeah, there were already some problematic developments in the drafting of the national recovery plans, where national governments were put pressure on to impose certain structural reforms. This we see quite critical. And also, I mean, if we compare the Recovery and Resilience Facility to the European structural funds, the governments is completely different. In the structural funds, which is like the other main EU investment in the European level, you have the partnership principle enshrined. And the partnership principle gives social partners and other civil society organizations power to define the targets of the program. It gives us power also to link the disbursement of funds to certain social criteria. And this is all not the case in the Recovery and Resilience Facility. And if it is to be if it is to be put on a permanent foot, then the political governance of the Recovery and Resilience Facility has to be improved.
Maybe very quickly a point on that, if I may. I mean, I think whether Next Generation EU will turn out to be perceived as a success will have a huge impact on future European integration debates, especially in the member countries that receive a large chunk of the grants. And from this perspective, this will be also important for future European integration debates. However, when it comes to this debate about making Next Generation permanent, I would approach it a little bit from a different angle. I think one of the problems is that there is now also this perception that, well, Next Generation EU funds go mostly to the countries that were hit harder by the crisis. And do we really want to have permanent transfers? This discussion we are always having. So I think we should more push the debate in the direction that we say, and we also discussed this today, there will be crises in the future. We don't know what countries will be hit hardest by this. I mean, we could also imagine the Netherlands in the future climate crisis running into deep trouble, and thereby also needing European support and temporary European transfers. So to have kind of a sizable budget at the European level that also allows for macroeconomic stabilization. We discussed automatic stabilizers as well today, so also some kind of automatic stabilization from the European level, and which goes to the countries that then need it the most. I think that is something that would be sensible, and I think one would need to explain also to politicians and the audience in Germany and the so-called frugal countries that their countries might also benefit from this in the future. So it's not like a one-way street.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you to all our panelists, so Dominika Vigon, Steve Keen, Philip Heinberger, and Aurora Villock. Apologies. And also, obviously, thanks once again to Marco and Joe Stiglitz. We're coming to the end of this session, so I'm actually just going to pass over to Luca Vicentini, who's General Secretary of the European Trade Union Confederation, who I think just wants to make a few closing remarks. Luca.
Thank you very much, Lydia, and thank you very much to all of you for this very exciting debate that you have conducted over many days this week. It was a very timely discussion, I have to say, and I would like first of all to thank all the organizers that need to be mentioned, the European Environment Bureau, the European Youth Forum, Climate Action Network Europe, Finance Watch, the New Economic Foundation, the Green Intervention, the Sustainable Finance Lab, the Foundation Nicolas Hulot, and Zoe Institute. Sorry for the long list, but I think it's important to mention the incredible effort that has been put to organize this massive reflection and very, very exciting series of debates. It was also particularly interesting the fact that these debates were really decentralized and at the same time at high level. There were a lot of distinguished panelists, keynote speakers, but also people coming from the youth organizations, representatives of many other civil society organizations, trade unions, of course, academics, think tanks, writers, journalists, and many, many others. Many topics have been discussed, and I think it's also important that these discussions provoked the continuation of a debate that is very often run too much behind closed doors in the bubbles, the so-called bubbles. We need really to bring this debate to the open in a way that really becomes also a good foundation for policy decision. But let's go briefly to content, because there were many things that have been discussed even in the last couple of panels, and I would like to refer to some of them. I've been very excited by the points that have been made by Marco Butti and by Joe Stiglitz, but also by the discussion that has followed just now in this very interesting panel. Starting point, I think, is to recognize that the European Union has managed to launch an incredibly ambitious plan for investment to respond to the crisis that has come from the pandemic. And before this ambitious investment plan, the European Union has also agreed in 2020 during the summer to finance an extraordinary emergency plan with important measures that have really contributed significantly to save millions of jobs, businesses, and also to support the public and health services that were unfortunately previously hard hit by austerity policies. If our public services and health services were not able to be resilient facing the pandemic at the beginning of this crisis, this was due for sure to the cuts, horrible cuts that we had experienced in the previous years. And we have to recognize that the money that has been put at disposal of the healthcare services in the different countries was really essential. But also the fact that, you know, this crisis has created 23 million unemployed people. And on top of that, there were 40 million people that were suspended from their jobs and have benefited from the different short-time work arrangements and income compensation schemes that have been activated at national level. Before the pandemic, only 11 countries had this kind of stabilizers. We have mentioned them, different kind of protection systems that could really protect people in case of globalization, restructuring, massive dismissals, etc. Only 11 countries had these systems in place. The pandemic, the emergency measures, sure in particular, have generated a, let's say, virtuous circle that has made possible that in all the 27 countries of the European Union now, we have this kind of protection system. So these efforts were extraordinary. And this was really, to some extent, a game changer. The fact that emergency measures were put in place, 500 billion euros, and then 750 plus, as Marco Butti said, the billion euros for the next generation EU investment plans. This is something really, really important to be underlined, also because this meant really that Europe moved out from the austerity ideology, first of all, and also the European member states, together with the European institutions, were able for the first time ever to take decisions on these extraordinary measures in few months, together and in solidarity. And also they were able to take a decision about issuing Eurobonds, something that was impossible even to be imagined few months ago, not even few years ago. Few months ago, the pandemic hit Europe and the rest of the world. You perfectly remember the incredible discussions that were initiated by Jean-Claude Juncker, by the way, when he was president of the Eurogroup many, many years ago, when he launched the idea of Eurobonds for the first time. And then we had more than a decade of useless discussions and political fights between the different countries. It was impossible to introduce European debt during the financial and economic crisis. Just austerity was the reply to that crisis. So having now Eurobonds was really an historical move from the European Union. And we have really to thank Paolo Gentiloni for this, because it was him that found a way, let's say, some kind of tricky solution in the treaties, a specific article that made possible in few months to make an agreement in Council about the issuing of European debt, without calling it Eurobonds, but in practice is exactly the kind of Eurobonds we were discussing about for so many years with no results. So all this is the starting point, because without recognizing this, I mean, we are framing the discussion about the reform of the fiscal rules in the wrong context. This is the context in which we are now. So we had some progress, and this can introduce some hopes in the possibility of having also further reforms, especially when it comes to the fiscal rules. And when we discuss about Next Generation EU, we have also to address another point. That is a point that also Marco Buti made. Will we be able to make Next Generation EU a success? So this means we will be able to spend the money well and to deliver what we call a fair, sustainable, and inclusive recovery. You know, this is the major challenge at the moment, because if we fail on this, there will be no hope at all that we can really reform in a progressive and sustainable way our economic model and our fiscal rules. If, on the contrary, we make Next Generation EU becoming a success, then we have a chance also to create, let's say, the political mood all around Europe to go further and to address the next step, that is exactly the reform of the fiscal rules. And I say that this is the major challenge because we are not yet there. We have the money, we have the national recovery and resilience plans, we have some guidance in place from the European Commission, but we are not yet there in terms of processes and tools to make sure that this will be a success story for all of us. So it's important in terms of economic policy to ask ourselves what are the conditions and the factors that have to be put in place to make sure that we can make the RRF and Next Generation EU a success. I would like to mention a few of them, at least three. The first one is that we need to avoid a mistake we made after the financial and economic crisis when we enter into some kind of recovery, because we had some kind of recovery between 2013, 2015, and 2019 before the pandemic hit. There was a recovery. This recovery was also helped by the so-called Juncker's plans for investment, also some kind of new tool that was established in this respect, but we cannot ignore that recovery that we had in the last decade was a jobless recovery, and a recovery that didn't address the problem of inequalities and discrimination and exclusion that existed before, of course, this recovery, but was still there when the recovery started making some effects. So the first question is how we can make sure that this time this will not be a jobless recovery, a recovery that increases inequalities and social exclusion. And on the contrary, is a recovery that can really create the conditions for a massive number of quality jobs to be created where and how they are needed. The second big challenge that is part of these big questions is how to make sure that we can achieve a fair and inclusive climate and digital transition, what we call a just transition. So how we can avoid that these enormous transitions, so tricky transitions that we are facing, will create again those economic and social deserts that we have created during the globalization period, during the financiarization of the economy, during the financial and economic crisis. We have too many communities, too many regions in Europe where productions, activities have been dismantled without creating an alternative. Maybe creating some alternative 1,000 kilometers far from there, but in those communities we have just created unemployment, social exclusion, marginalization, and inequalities. So we cannot allow again this to happen. We cannot accept that the climate and the digital transition, achieving the targets of the Green Deal, making sure that the Digital Act of the European Union will succeed, will mean that there will be thousands, millions of people left behind. And the third big challenge that we have in this respect is that we need to make sure that recovery is accompanied by a new social contract, what the United Nations, the ILO call a new social contract. So how we can reform and then reinforce our European social model, which was something that everybody around the world was envying us, and that is being harmed in a horrible way by austerity policies. So how we can reduce the level of inequalities and social exclusion by refounding, reforming radically, and relaunching significantly our European social model through a new social contract in Europe. So these three elements, how to make sure that we don't have another jobless recovery, how we make sure that we have a real just transition, and how to make sure that we can have a social contract for Europe. These are fundamental elements to make Next Generation EU being a success. And what do we need to do that? And this is also about economic policy, you know, it's not only fiscal rules. Also, concrete economic policy means that we need to put in place some concrete actions to achieve these objectives. The first one is that at the core of Next Generation EU, at the core of each and every of the national recovery and resilience plans, we need an industrial plan. An industrial plan that means that we know where we want our economy to go. What are the sectors, what are the projects on which we want to invest our money? The United States, China, even Russia know that. They design every year what kind of sectors and industrial plans they want to put at the core of their investment policy. And you know, this happens in a communist system like in China, and in a capitalistic system like in the US, or in a populist system like in Russia. Why this is not possible in Europe? Why is Europe so fragmented and each and every member state has to deal with its own industrial plan? Why is it not possible to have a comprehensive and coherent industrial plan at the European level? This is the first element to reflect about if we want to pave the path for a sustainable recovery. The second element is that we have to have rid of this compensatory approach that we always had in the past. We first destroy jobs, we first dismantle our industry, and then we see how we can compensate the people that are left behind with some kind of social protection measures, some kind of pre-retirement scheme, some kind of training paths, and then we train perfectly trained unemployed people that will never find another job. So this compensatory approach is wrong, and unfortunately is still present also in Next Generation EU. We have to move out from that and go for an anticipation of change approach. That means not only training and social protection, but governance in the communities, in the territories, social dialogue, collective bargaining, workers' participation, institutions and social partners coming together to set a framework for just transition. All this is complex, you know. It's not something that is manageable very easily, but it needs really to be at the core of our recovery policy. Third element, we need to reform our labor law, our labor market systems, our social protection and pension systems in a way that we can really achieve universality and adequacy of our social economic model. So no more structural reforms that just mean cuts, because this was one of the biggest mistakes we made in the past and made our social protection systems and public services not resilient to face the crisis. And last but not least, to make all of this working, we need to introduce an approach in the way we spend the money that should be based not on sanctions, but on incentives, on conditionalities, positive and progressive conditionalities, and monitoring tools in a way that we can really spend the money well. To achieve all targets, and also those of the Green Deal and of the European Pillar of Social Rights, we need to channel the money, to channel the investment in the right way. So, as you can see, it cannot be just about fiscal rules. It's also about having an economic policy at the basis of Next Generation EU, and this economic policy is not yet there. It has to be done now, so it's very important to rethink the way we are going to implement these projects. And in parallel, of course, we need to discuss the reform of the fiscal rules before the general escape clause expires. Otherwise, the debt of the different member states will become unsustainable in the medium term, and recovery will turn again into a recession. We all know what has to be done. It has been mentioned by all of you. Make Next Generation EU, the EU fiscal capacity, the Eurobonds, permanent tools. Make sure that we have a taxation reform at the European level to support this fiscal capacity and the own resources of the European Union. Use this for the EU to pay back the European debt that has been generated so far. There was a question in the chat about this. I think this is a very important element to be considered. Introduce, of course, you have mentioned that, macroeconomic stabilizers. From a trade union point of view, the first one to be considered is to turn instruments like SURE into a permanent European unemployment and employment support or insurance mechanism. Every of these stupid targets, 3%, 60%, that have been explained very well as stupid targets by Joe Stiglitz, by Romano Prodi, even in the past, by many others, and replace them, and replace the sanction-based approach with a golden rule and an approach based on incentives and conditionalities, positive conditionalities. Reform the European semester in a way that is more democratic, in a way that supports investment and sustainable growth, and in a way that the semester embeds the Green Deal and the European Pillar of Social Rights in the country-specific recommendations, because today we still operate in silos. By the way, in this respect, we need also to add social and environmental imbalances to the macroeconomic imbalances procedure. This, by the way, is a proposal that is coming at the moment from the Belgian and the Spanish government that has to be supported by all countries in the Council. And finally, last but not least, we need also to think about reforming the mandate of the European Central Bank to move full employment and environmental sustainability from the secondary targets to the primary targets of the European Central Bank. Does this make sense in economic terms? Yes, it does. Do we have the political condition to achieve all this? Well, this is more difficult to be said. But let's reverse the question. What can we do to make it happen? In this sense, I think you have mentioned the two key words, ambition and pragmatism at the same time. Ambition, as the one we had during the pandemic, the biggest crisis ever. To get out of this crisis, we need finally to radically change our economic model to make it fair, sustainable, and inclusive. The debate, by the way, on a new economic model going beyond the GDP based on well-being of people, this debate is actually now happening, not only among academics or NGOs. This is happening in the institutional circles. The president of the European Council, Charles Michel, has asked no more than 6 months ago to the European social partners to deliver concrete proposals on how to start discussing in council, so where the member states, the governments sit, to start discussing a new economic model going beyond GDP and based on well-being. But at the same time, we need also pragmatism. How can we make the reform of the fiscal rules happen? Of course, not through unanimity. This is impossible. We need to go through qualified majority voting, so probably we cannot completely change the Stability and Growth Pact, but there are many other things that can be done, and Gentiloni has explained this very clearly recently in an Italian seminar. We can do it through qualified majority voting. There are many ways to achieve the same result. So to conclude, I think that we all bear the responsibility to act. Of course, institutions, of course, government, European institutions, the European Parliament, the Commission, at the same time also local administrations, politicians everywhere in Europe, but also NGOs, different associations, social partners, all the actors in the society. We have all to be connected among ourselves, networking, and at the same time also be active in our lobbying, in our actions. We have a great leverage that comes from the crisis. This crisis was a tragedy, but at the same time gives also the opportunity to change things more than ever, more than before. So I really think that we can do it together, we can succeed. So let's continue this discussion, but especially let's act together. We can make it. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Luca, and thank you once again to all our participants today, and of course to all of you for attending. We hope you've enjoyed the discussion and indeed the whole week if you've been to other events as well. And in the meantime, enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you once again.